I think when we go about this project of reading, this act of reading, we might not understand everything that we read, but it's going to affect us. It's going to change us. And I think that's where the real importance lies. It's not in memorizing every factoid about the life of this person. It's not about being able to relate personally to everything they experience. All of that can be put aside, and what we can really encounter is not the style, we can encounter the person.
Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to another episode of Carmelcast. Carmelcast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. For more information, you can visit our website at icspublications.org. And I'm very happy to be joined today by Father Pier Giorgio of Christ the King for this episode where we're going to be talking about a specialty of his, I think a particular interest of his, and that's reading spiritual autobiographies, but particularly through the lens of Saint Edith Stein.
Yeah. Well, so it's not just Saint Edith Stein. It's the whole like history of this process of reading spiritual autobiography within the context of the church. So one of the earliest sort of things that the Christians would do would be writing the stories of the martyrs, right?
It's interesting how when we pray at Mass, the Roman canon, we recite the names of all these people. And I think that's something that's lost on us today, but how important that would have been in the early church,
right,
of the story of these people that we're recalling during the Mass.
Right, and then we can pinpoint these moments of grace that happen throughout the history of the church that come as a direct result of someone having taken and read, the Tolli et Lege that Augustine speaks about, the voice that he hears, take and read. And we do that with the scriptures, of course, and that was in the case of Augustine. It was St. Paul, how he relates it in the Confessions, which is his spiritual autobiography. So, kind of getting into that a little bit there as well. And just so these points of people picking up the lives of the saints, and perhaps even autobiography, testimony of their lives that these saints themselves wrote, and having a moment of transformation. So Athanasius writes the life of Saint Anthony. Augustine writes his Confessions. Saint Teresa of Avila picks up the Confessions, reads that, and that influences her and her conversion, and as a result goes on to write her own autobiography, her own testimony, which then Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein picks up, reads, and is the sort of penultimate effect of her conversion to the faith, to Christianity.
Yeah. I think that word of testimony is a very important way to understand what's going on here, because we see even today, right? Like, people love watching videos or hearing stories of people's conversions because it like stirs something within us to hear the story of the testimony of another person, and like draws us deeper into conversion ourselves, I think.
This probably happens to you too, but people ask, we want to hear your vocation story. We want to hear your testimony. It's like, this is the last thing that I want to do is tell you that. But
and then I say, okay, do you want the 60-second version, like the 5-minute version, or like the 15-minute version? Because I have all of those. I can tell, right away,
And they're rehearsed because we relate them so often. Let me tell you the story of how I got to wear this. Let me tell you the story of how I became a faithful Catholic. And so we have these are a big part of us. And while we don't always like sharing them in front of rooms full of people, we always receive the feedback in the end of how much that it impacted people and hearing it. And not only because they like hearing people's stories and we like hearing other people's stories, but we relate to them. We see ourselves in their story, and it reminds us of how God changed us. When we see how God changed this person, well, I remember how he changed my life. And then it begins this whole sort of process of interior sort of, you could say like a recollection of oneself and one's life, and how God has sort of has broken through various times in our life. And I think that's really what comes out in reading. Call it spiritual testimony or spiritual autobiography. I actually prefer the word testimony as in terms of the word for the genre of writing, because I think, like you say, it has that much more meaning. Like, anybody can write an autobiography, and it might be good, it might be terrible. But what's really at work in the testimony is not the sort of day by day recollection of one's life, over the course of one's life. But in Story of a Soul, she doesn't get into every nitty gritty. She spends more time in one place, less time in other places. Same with Saint Teresa. And so, what's really the object of their what they're doing is that testimonial part. That this is important. Not everything that happened to me is as important as this that I'm writing down and sharing with you.
Right. And there's something about a testimony where it's really the giving of yourself, which I think we'll get into that more.
Yes, we will.
But you're giving of yourself through the words that are written, which it puts it on a different level, because like the reading the lives of the saints is a great thing, right? And it's very inspirational. But when you're reading about the life of a saint written by the saint, it takes on like a whole deeper meaning,
Right.
I think.
Right, and it's similarly too when we read the writings of the saints, maybe not testimonial or biographical, we take it more seriously, right? It's something. Well, this is somebody who's been vetted and who's important, and what they have to say matters. And so similarly with the story of their whether it be their conversion or the story of an important moment in their life, it's something that was worth for them to write down and to share.
Right.
And I think that's the justification of the genre right then and there. They wrote it down, so they must have thought it was important.
Yeah, and I mean, in this episode, we're really going to turn to Edith Stein, Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross, to see what she can teach us about how to read these books. But it's very appropriate that she's the one teaching us too, because she herself wrote an autobiography.
She herself wrote an autobiography, and she herself was changed by the reading of an autobiography.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we could start there then with her own conversion, like what the story that led to her conversion.
Yeah, and we did a whole half episode on kind of the conversion of Edith Stein, St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross, so there's going to be more there. So, but maybe just give the Cliff Notes version of that. She writes her dissertation under Edmund Husserl, famous philosopher in Germany in the early 20th century. And her dissertation is on the subject of empathy. And we'll talk about that in a little bit shortly, a little bit later from now. She writes her dissertation on empathy, and she ends her dissertation with this question. As you know, when we're taught to write term papers, we sometimes are asked to do this as well. It's like, what's the next steps? Okay, so you've done this study, you've written this paper. Maybe in your conclusion, what's next? What are you going to do next? And the answer to that sort of exercise that she ends her dissertation with is how do I experience the religious experiences of other people? Because she's just spent a good 100 pages on figuring out how we experience other people's experiences. But she's speaking of it more in terms of the everyday experiences of other people. Maybe not every day in the sense of going to the grocery store, but every day in the sense of things that happen to us over the course of our lifetime.
Like the pains and joys.
The pains, the joys, exactly. Like the thing, how do I relate to the other person who's feeling joyful? How do I relate to the other person who's feeling very sad and mourning? And so she's talking about this problem and how I can approach that person. We'll get to that shortly. In any case, she ends her dissertation with how do I engage the religious experiences of other people? So this is sort of a hanging, looming question. She writes letters to her friends saying, this is what I'm going to study for the rest of my career. I want to study this. She starts reading, all of these Freud and all these people who are interested in kind of weird experiences that people are having. She starts reading William James, who has this whole series of essays on religious experience. And she's approaching it from she's not a Christian yet.
Yeah,
so
where is she at?
Yeah, so she's approaching this from the perspective of secular German intellectia, academia. And so she's reading all these people trying to find these answers. And as she's boarding a train to go spend the holidays with a friend who lives a couple hours train ride from where she was at that time, her friend hands her a copy of the life of St. Teresa, the book of her life. So Teresa's spiritual autobiography, her testimony of her conversion. And she reads it, and it's this, she later relates, that is the catalyst for her conversion, her baptism into the Catholic Church. And so this looming question in her head somehow must have been answered in the reading of Teresa of Avila's autobiography. And so she has some sort of profound experience of the truth or conviction as a result of the grace of God in Teresa's life that then sort of brings her over that sort of growing edge that she had of growing towards more and more into faith.
And in the story or the recounting of she read this, and then what was her like reaction to it? I don't know if it's
Yeah.
historically true, but it speaks something of the truth of what
Well,
happened.
yeah. So it's related, and I don't know that she ever relates this. That she finished it and said, "This is the truth. This is the truth." And so after reading Freud, after reading James, all of these secular sort of people who are coming at this problem, she reads Teresa, and that's where she arrives. That's where she says, "This is how it happens. She has something to say about the religious experience, and she has related it to me in this testimony, so much so that it has profoundly affected me, such that I desire to have what she has, and I'm going to be baptized."
Yeah, that was gonna be my question. I don't know if you haven't a thought on this, but like, what was it about that book? Do you think that
So
spoke to her?
that's like why that's the exact question that I had that made me want to study this problem. It's like, well, Teresa Benedicta wrote a lot, and she wrote a lot about the subject of intersubjectivity. So like, she was a very cerebral person, right? And so she wouldn't have read the book of her life like she read, Reader's Digest or Mad Magazine or something like that, mundanely or even as we would read a novel. I think she saw this as an opportunity for an experience to really get into the head of this mystical saint. And so she would have been reading it with all of those reading skills and philosophical sort of understandings and concepts that she had developed over the course of her academic life. And she would have applied those things into the reading of this text. And so that's why I think it's appropriate that she reads, or providential, that she reads the book of her life, Teresa's life, after she writes her dissertation on this whole subject of intersubjectivity and empathy and relating to other people and how I see myself and how I see other people. And so if you can always sort of read the writings of Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Edith Stein, through the lens of her dissertation because of what her dissertation's about. You can't do that with everybody, right? We can do that with St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross because of the subject matter of how I relate to other people. It's very ethical, right? It's something it's something that's very important. And we have to remember too that God is a person. He's in fact three persons. And so we can, the same way that we relate to, you relate to me, I relate to you. Well, there's something called the incarnation. God becomes man such that I can relate to God in a similar way, a manner in which that I relate to any other human being. Because before the incarnation, that would have been in Judaism, that would have been blasphemous, right? To imagine God as another human being, or to treat him as a mere human. But he's fully man and he's fully God, and so that enables us to do this. And so this is I think at the center of all her writing, this idea of yes, how do human beings interrelate? But let's take that all the way to its most infinite heights, which is our relationship with God. And so whether it's her own autobiography, whether it's spiritual writings she writes, whether it's essays or conferences that she spoke and gave at conferences and talks and things like that, we can read all of these things through this sort of kernel in the center of her intellectual life that was empathy, this idea of empathy.
Yeah. And could we go into that topic
Yeah.
a little bit more? Because we're talking about intersubjectivity and empathy, and those can be complicated terms. So like, what was her, even before her conversion, what was her interest and what was her project kind of moving forward in this area? Well,
so it comes from really what the philosophical school of phenomenology wanted to do. So it's coming from Germany. So Germany is wrapped up in this movement called German idealism, which is saying something to the effect that things aren't what they are in and of themselves, but it's rather the ideas that are kind of inherent in the things. I don't want to get into that, but in the sense that there was a rejection of that idea and wanted to have more of a realistic sort of understanding of the world, that things matter, and the things that we approach each and every day matter. And the way that I approach them matters. And so, for instance, I can't in this moment know the back of your head because that vision isn't granted to me by virtue of what I have, which are eyes. And now if there was a mirror right there, then yes, I would be able to. And so all of these things mean something, right? The way the world is means something. The fact that there's me and I'm experiencing the world and I'm encountering other people who I need to take for granted also are experiencing the world. And maybe I can gain some understanding from someone else's perspective. It's like, when we're asking for someone to, let's say we're like unplugging a drain, and I'm underneath the sink and you're looking down at me through the drain, and say, oh, can you see that thing? Can you pull it out? You are seeing something that I can't, and together we're gaining some knowledge. So just from something mundane like that, we can see, how other people matter within the context of our how we encounter the world and the problems that we have in the midst of our daily life.
So the perspective is maybe expanded from the thing in itself to how it is that a person, different people, experience that thing.
Right.
That becomes a part of the question or the inquiry into a better understanding of what the thing is.
And the way that you helped me to unplug that drain, I mean, I could rig some like fancy like mirror system so that I could see what you're seeing, or maybe I have a camera like one of those like snake cameras, and I can see what you could see if you weren't there. But there's something different about my taking your word as opposed to using some sort of technology to do the same thing, or a mirror to do the same thing. And there's a recognition of that as well within this context. And that's what kind of we were talking about, intersubjectivity. So a mirror is an object, right? However, I'm a subject. And so I can use an object to solve the problem, but I can also ask another subject, another me, another someone else who calls himself me, who calls himself I. I can ask that person to come help me with this issue. And that and maybe this example is breaks down after a while, but we can see it much more better in much bigger problems.
Well, and also in questions of relationality between people, right? Because say if there's a third person here, like your perspective of that person and my perspective of that person might be very different.
Right.
And there's something about those coming together that brings something totally new to you that you wouldn't be able to get if you had just a mirror looking at the person from a different perspective.
Yeah. We could use an example from her own time, very close to her as well. And it's where a lot of this sort of the literary theory of testimony gets really worked out in the 20th century. And it's over testimonial writings of the Holocaust, right? So shortly after World War II, there's a lot of kind of conflicting information about what happened in the East, right? East of Germany in these camps. And there are survivors of these incidents, such that they're able to write testimonies, right? And so we are able to get a picture of what was going on, even though these people might not have survived the camps, but we have some sort of record of what they wrote down, maybe a diary, a testimony, something, and we're able to gain a better understanding of something that we can't verify with video footage or like we would be able to today, right? Someone with a cell phone recording an incident, right? And so the narrative or the literary genre of testimony is something that's considered to be very powerful. A lot of it comes out of a lot of the civil wars in Latin America as well, a lot of these testimonies of what happened. And so we can see that as a much bigger problem, right? And how I'm able to grapple with that problem despite not having seen it.
Right.
I can use someone else's testimony, and that testimony has this reality to it such that it has the capacity to move me. It has the capacity to convict me of the fact of what happened. Right.
Right. And we see how important this is. I think even on a natural level, if we look at the nightly news, right? The nightly news, they could just give you statistics, and that would probably be the most scientific way to see what does this person think, or what do people generally think about this topic? But that's not what they do. They go and they interview a person, and you hear that person's own experience, even if it's not representative of even the majority opinion or most people's opinion. There's something in that experience that's powerful, and we're drawn to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a there's a lot going on in that, and how that happens, and why that happens, and why we are convicted by one thing more so than another thing. Because there are conflicting stories. There were Holocaust deniers, right? And so how do I distinguish between this person's testimony and this person's testimony? Well, there's something in this person's testimony that is convicting. that has a basis of humanity within it.
Right.
Whereas this sounds like somebody's fabricating some misinformation.
And how does all this relate to Teresa Benedict or Edith Stein's work of like in her dissertation?
Yeah. So this whole aspect of how do I know, how am I convicted by other people's experiences? How do I experience the other person's experience that I myself have not experienced? The answer that she gives is essentially this concept of empathy. Einfühlung in German. Einfühlungsvermögen is the more complete term. And what that basically means is it's a capacity. Vermögen means it's like a capacity. It's a capacity. Fühlung means like contact. Ein is like a singular, so it's like a capacity for singular contact between two things, right? And so there's some sort of thing that the empathic person has that enables them to have a point of contact with the other person, such that there is a real conviction contact with what they experience, such that it has a strong bearing in my experience of experiencing them who had experienced something.
Okay, yeah, and I think we can go into maybe some examples from Teresa Benedicta's own life, but could you also just like say we have two people like Bob and Sally, like what is she talking about?
One way that St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross does this is by comparing the events of people I know to the experience I have of reading very moving fiction. Okay? And so she uses the example of the Iliad. There's this scene in the Iliad where Hector kills Patroclus and Achilles just goes nuts, right? And it's a very moving scene because you see in Achilles going nuts how much he loved Patroclus. And it's very, incredibly moving, very emotional. Homer has this way of just sort of depicting this in a way that doesn't seem like it was written, however many thousands of years ago from now, and we can experience that, and we can be moved. We can shed tears. We can never forget having read the scene. I remember the first like moving novel that I read as a young man, which was really a boy, which was The Outsiders. You remember The Outsiders?
I do. Yeah.
Well, there's that scene where Johnny goes into the burning church and rescues all the children. Very moving, and it's like the first experience. It's something that affected me very deeply. And I don't want to give any. I already spoiled the Iliad, so I won't spoil The Outsiders. But this very moving scene can affect us very profoundly, such that we never forget it. It comes within us very interiorly, and it's an experience that we never forget. And so similarly, with experiencing other people, there are certain experiences we have of other people. Maybe hearing someone tell their story, right? Hearing someone share their experience. I heard recently someone gave a couple years ago. Someone gave a talk about their experiencing having been arrested in captivity in Syria. And just very, very moving experience of just listening to this person talk and everything that he went through, and the story of how he was rescued is just incredible. And so we have these experiences of other people, such that they're really sharing something of themselves. It's not it's not I like Thai food, or I like my favorite color is purple, or something like that. It's an experience of themselves. It's very they're sharing something. You're receiving something that is really truly them.
And so empathy is then the capacity to enter into that experience of the other.
I think empathy for Teresa Benedicta is the capacity to be able to receive. It's a receptive capacity. It's the ability to receive what the person is sharing with me on a very interior, subjective level. So the way that she formulates it is, I'm not receiving it simply as the relating of some object, the relating of what this person's favorite color is, or the fact that it's coming from some dude that I don't know, right? In sort of an empathic receptivity of another person, what's really happening, what's under the hood, so to speak, of what's going on here, is I am approaching this other person in a manner of which I approach myself. It's a recognition of that person as another I. It's somebody who has a subject. It's somebody who can experience things. It's somebody who can experience things very profoundly and deeply. And I can see in receiving this recitation or this talk or this relation of what this person went through, I can receive that more deeply, knowing that, rather than a literary fictional character or a TV show or something like that, where at the back of my mind I know that this isn't nonfiction. This isn't real. This isn't historical. This is something that is artistically made up.
And maybe it'd be helpful here. Could you explain, like, is there a difference then between what we're talking about here with empathy and like sympathy?
Yeah. So sympathy, it comes from Latin. So with with, and pathos. Passion or suffering. And so it's to suffer with, and it literally is what that means. And of course, that takes on more than just kind of negative suffering sort of content. Maybe we can say, oh, I have sympathy for your understanding, or I have sympathy for those people. This is something, I would say that's more of a feeling. That's more of an emotion.
Right.
That's more of an exercise, so to speak. Empathy is a capacity that has to be, that's interior to us, and has to be developed and formed, and has to be, undergoes development over the course of our life, such that we ought to become more empathetic and I like to use the word empathic more than empathetic, because I think it has that more of a capture of what's really less of an emotion and more of a thing that we have, and that we cherish, and that we develop and we nourish.
Right. So, I mean, is it fair? I'm just trying to like play this out. Is it fair to say, like, say you experienced, the death of a loved one? I could feel sympathy for you in the sense that hearing about that just like kind of draws forth an emotion within me, and that's certainly a good thing. There's maybe a more intellectual way in which it's like I can understand what you're going through. But it seems to me empathy is like something deeper than those. It's something that involves like more of it's more intuitive. It involves like the whole person, not just something that's emotional or intellectual, but it's more complete.
Yeah, it's limited in that sense. What you can do with my kind of, you seeing me bubbling up with emotion and sadness or mourning, what you're able to experience in merely just observation is somewhat limited, by the fact that you can't. I myself might not completely understand what's going on in me as this is happening.
Yeah.
And so your ability to really perceive that is also even more so limited. And so what empathy has to be something deeper than merely, I can relate to what you went through because, 10 years ago something similar happened to me, or I can imagine, like, what if that. So let's say I experienced the death of a friend, and you then do the equivalent sort of, okay, who is that person in my life? How would I feel if I lost that person? And so you can do kind of this conceptual sort of gymnastics in order to like try to feel what that person's feeling. And for Teresa Benedict of the Cross, empathy is something that is much much deeper than that. It's this capacity for regardless of how well you understand it, it's this capacity for being able to receive a part or an aspect of the person who you're experiencing this with, more so than just the superficial sort of emotions or kind of like equivalents of who that person is in my life, like those sort of things that we do when we try to. Because I mean, honestly, like what's the purpose of that? Okay, I need to make this person. I need to comfort this. But that's usually what it comes down to. I need to comfort this person, and so we do these things as a way to like emotionally enter into what they're feeling. But we're really just entering into their emotions, which is a rather superficial aspect. And what we really in empathy are doing is fixating on an aspect of that person's self.
Yeah. As you're speaking of this, I'm reminded very much of Edith Stein's work on woman, and because this seems to be a particularly like feminine gift that women are just maybe born with more naturally than men are, to be, and that's why they, Teresa Benedicta talks about them women going into particular fields they're maybe more gifted at, again, naturally, fields that I think require greater empathy, whether that's like healthcare or education. But these are fields where it's so important to be able to receive the other person.
Yeah.
And that's a very, like, again, feminine virtue, is to like receive the other and meet them, like bring them into yourself and be with them there in that space.
Yeah, and I think there's a receptivity to femininity more so than masculinity, which kind of goes along with this aspect of empathy, right? The other thing that I would say just about empathy, is that it can be very dangerous for us to claim certain things about other people and what they're feeling, right? We can say, "Oh, I know what you're going through." And it's like, what is, if someone says that to you and you're like really struggling with something, what is your initial sort of response to that?
It's like, you have no idea.
You have no idea what I'm going through, right? And so this is another aspect of that. Really, what empathy is it preserves the integrity of the otherness, the otherness of that other, of what they're experiencing. I can't read, Solzhenitsyn's, Gulag Archipelago and say, oh, this is like my novitiate or something, something like that. There's something completely different from my own experience, and maybe even if I did experience something that was deeply traumatic in my life, it's not helpful. It's not human. It's not authentic for me to try to make those connections as a way to relate to. There has to be something. We have to maintain that we call it alterity, that alienness of the other person's experiencing what they experienced, and that allows us to kind of, there's something sacred about the other person and their experience. And so don't cheapen that by trying to say, oh, this is like this, or I can imagine how that would happen to me in this situation.
Right. It reminds me of, I met someone today who I think has a very different life experience than I do, experiences the world in a very different way, very different background. But it was amazing to just like go into a conversation open to hear how the other person like experiences things and receives things. It's not saying that like I don't go in with any sense of like what I think is true, but it was a way to just like be there and like try to see like, how is this person perceiving the world? How is this person perceiving God? And I think because of that, it was a very fruitful conversation. Whereas if I just kind of come in with my own preconceptions, like guns blazing,
categories, preconceptions, all those things.
I wouldn't have been open to receive the gift that the other person was giving to me in the discussion.
There's a theorist that comes shortly after the lifetime of Saint Teresa Benedict of the Cross. His name was Emmanuel Levinas. He was a French Jewish thinker. He's writing in the aftermath of the Holocaust, obviously, and so he has this incredible insight in how he describes what this is like. And he calls it the face. It's the ethics of the face. And there's something about the individuality of the face and other people's faces, right? And how we're able to remember faces. And I think it's a beautiful way to understand this idea of empathy, because it's authentic. There's an authenticity to that sort of expression of this. It's like I am receiving what you're telling to me as I receive my, kind of like when I see your face, what that portrays, your entire individuality, your entire selfhood, your personhood, the sacredness of who the other person that I'm encountering is. I wanted to bring in an aspect of this that might help people to understand, and it's going back to this side, to comparing like my experience of fictional characters in reading a book, and this will maybe help us to get back into the autobiography discussion. So the difference between reading a book and encountering a character that we cherish and love, and we'll never, we'll forget this character, versus reading autobiography and having an experience somewhat like what we were talking about at the beginning of the episode. So we could use let's use my example of The Outsiders just for a moment.
I thought for sure you were going to use a Disney character.
Lady and the Tramp, it's my favorite movie. So. No, we'll do The Outsiders. So I can appreciate S.E. Hinton, the author of this book's characterization of Pony Boy, right, and all the boys in that book, right, just brilliant characters, brilliant characterization, the way they get along, is just really fantastic. At the bottom of that sort of appreciation is not a love for the characters as I love another human being. What really comes out of that in that experience is we say, oh, I love the writings of S.E. Hinton. I love that author because of the way they can portray characters. Mm-hmm. Maybe we have a love for a particular character in a way that more so than others. But really, it's an appreciation of the artist, the artistry, right? This person, and Teresa Benedicta talks about this in Finding Eternal Being, where she says that what's at the bottom of this sort of experience is that experience of an artistic rendering of an authentic character, that is a skill, right? It's a skill that one is either gifted at or acquires over the course of their lifetime. When we are reading something like autobiography, apply that same framework, right? I love this character in this this testimony. I love what she experiences. I love how she expresses herself. I love how she relates to her friends. And then I do that same trajectory. Oh, that character I love is also the author. Mm. And then even beyond that, the author of that character, the author is God. Mm. And so there's a trajectory here that I think can bring us to something that is deeply spiritual in nature, something that is very divine, because we're seeing the artistry of that person. Mm-hmm. And that is initiated by God alone.
Mm-hmm. So in some ways, the life of each individual is the story told by the author, who's God.
Well, I mean, intermediate with her is the author themselves, right? So
right, but I'm saying just the life of the individual, not the writing, but even just like the lived experience of each individual we encounter is a story that's told by an author who's God that can draw us to love Him, and so then their writing of their story is another step in that loving and experiencing them and experiencing that author who is God. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and so I think with this there's an aspect of how do I receive? So for the most part, when we're talking about spiritual testimony, we're speaking about people who are no longer on this earth, right? And so I can't relate to St. Teresa Benedict of the Cross in the same way that I relate to you, because I can't ask her questions and knock on her door and bug her when they're trying to do work or pray and ask all these questions about different things that are rather mundane or important. Right?
I like how that's how you define our relationships.
You answer all my questions
when you knock on my door.
But just to say that we can't do that with her. And so what a lot of the theory of kind of like Holocaust testimony gets at is this idea, and what people like Levinas were talking about is this whole idea of, well, we lack their corporality in being able to like touch them and being able to, shake their hand, hug them, all of these things. We lack that ability, but what we can do is they've left a part of themselves within the pouring out of their own self into their writing. Mm-hmm. And in particular, testimonial writing, because it's something that's much more personal and much more intimate, much more interior to who they were. Mm-hmm. And it allows us, and more so than our relationship with our friends, it's easier for that aspect of otherness, that alterity, to be preserved because we can't ask them to elaborate. We can't ask them to explain better or more, or can you tell that to me again in a way that maybe I understand it better. We're not able to do that, and so there's this aspect. There's a veil there that we can't see them, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we can read the book with a photograph of them in front of us, but we can't see them in the sense of how we can see the people who we experience in our daily life. Mm-hmm. And that's deeply important, I think, in this whole framework, because there's something that is particular about spiritual autobiography that is preserving that important aspect of empathy.
Like, so you're saying it's preserving more greatly the otherness, in a way that is unique to that genre, different from
Right.
like a conversation you might have with a friend.
Right, because the best, I shouldn't say the only way, but the best way that I can reach out and grab St. Teresa Benedict at the cross is by picking up this book, right? And there's something that is rather different in my day-to-day experience of other people, and how I experience them. Being able to text them, being able to call them on the phone.
Right.
All I have is this. And so I think what the theory is saying is that that's actually important. It's not a what's the word? It's not a fault.
Like a deficiency.
It's not a deficiency. It's actually something that's very valuable because there's something that's deeply preserved in the otherness of my relating to another person only through writing and the relating of their story.
I wonder, and this is just me speculating, but as you're saying this, I'm wondering if maybe there's a way in which maybe this is just my own like narcissism speaking, but we can use those around us for our own fulfillment or our own, like we can almost objectify them in a way that I think
is harder to do.
Yeah, it's like there's nothing I can like get out of her.
And I think we engage the other person in reading in a much more authentic way ourselves, right? Because we're not worried about what they think of us. We're not worried about putting on airs. We're not worrying about, how I look or to them or those sort of things. And in that sense, that's another sort of...
yeah, that's a good point. I don't go to the book with this kind of shield up or this like false self. I go to it with like who I actually am. Right. Whereas when I encounter other people, there might be, just because of like even just, it's natural and to have proper manners and dignity, like we don't necessarily like pour our hearts out to another in the same way we can in reading a book.
Right. Right. And there's an aspect there of course the encounters can be much more meaningful to us because that encounter is happening in the context of a greater authenticity of myself.
Yeah. Greater vulnerability. Yeah. Authenticity. I think that's a good word for it. Yeah.
So another, I think, important thing about spiritual testimony is what happens to the author in the process of writing it. So we can speak about the times in which these authors wrote these things. So remember, like Story of a Soul is written, in the last years of Teresa's life at the request of her sisters. Life in a Jewish Family. St. Teresa Benedict, we haven't really talked about, I've held this book up, but I haven't mentioned it. Life in a Jewish Family, the autobiography of St. Edith Stein, is written in 1933. Hitler has just been elected Chancellor of Germany, and she's been fired from her job because she's ethnically Jewish. She had a state-funded job. She was a professor in a state university, so she lost her job. And she writes this as a testimony to say, and really it begins with she's telling the story of her mother, and then eventually morphs after a couple chapters into her own life. That's what the bulk of it is. But she writes it because she wants Catholics to understand that Jewish Germans are just like them. Their families are just like them. They have friends and stories and joys and sorrows just like them. And so there may be and Therese writes her Story of a Soul at the request of her sisters because they're kind of reminiscing and in memories and things like that. And so there's an aspect there that's important. Why did this person write this? Why do they think that it was important for them to share their own life with other people? Because you don't just write an autobiography for nothing. You might be asked to. That's in the case of Teresa or Therese. She wasn't asked to. But once you get started, something happens to you as an author. You want to be authentic. And there's probably aspects that you want to not show the whole world either. It's like, I'm not going to relate that story because that's a little, something that I don't want to share or might affect my relationship with my family members if I tell them this family secret or something like that. But in the process of writing your story, your testimony, you're making a claim for your dignity. My story is important. and it's not that I have this sort of over-aggrandized sort of understanding of who I am, but there's a claim for your dignity. You're making it when you write your autobiography. You're making a claim for your dignity. You're making a claim for your selfhood, such that when people pick it up to read it, they are encountering your true self.
Yeah, so there's something you're even just by putting words on a page, you're like making them so real.
Yeah, there's a sense in which I'm doing something very intentional, and when someone reads something, that intentionality comes forward in a way, and it sort of it establishes its own importance by virtue of what the intention behind it was. And that's we can receive that intentionality. We can encounter that in a way that is really different with respect to how we encounter one another on a daily basis. Because maybe I catch you at a bad time, maybe you're in a bad mood, and so I get a bad impression in that moment of who you are, and then my experience of you is the sum of all my good and bad impressions of you. Well, that's kind of put aside in something like this because of the intentionality with which it's like she wrote this. She sat down and wrote this for the purpose of us receiving it, and so she's taking the time. Yeah. It's not a matter of if I caught you at a bad time or I'm catching her at a bad time. That intentionality sort of melts all that aspect of way of our kind of the way in which we're so different at different times.
Yeah, I'm reminded a little of the fact that when we hear the vocation stories of our brothers in community, it's something about that. It's like you can live with a person and maybe you don't get along really well, or maybe you just like don't quite understand them. And then when they share like how it is that the Lord drew them here, it's like you said, like kind of all that just melts away when you hear that experience.
Yeah, because it's like, okay, this is the real them. This is the real them. This is not.
And I see how God was like working in their life.
All right, there's one last part of this that I think is the kind of the most important, not the most, maybe it's a very important part, and it's how does that change me? In the literary tradition, there are these great novels that I think beginning with something like Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship is probably the classic example that people use of the first example of this, of a story being related by an author, giving the trajectory of this young man's life from maybe childhood to adulthood, but really focusing on how he changes over the course of that novel. What you call this might be different, but
I was going to say, isn't there a German term for this?
So Bildungsroman, is the name of this, and that word is even in the English dictionary because of we use that word too. Sometimes we say a coming of age novel, right? And what we love about those stories is those transitions, the development, the unfolding of this person and we see it too in like Story of a Soul. You see this bratty girl, silly emotions and things, and how that transformed into something that's much more profound. And we love a transformation story, the Paschal Mystery, the Gospel transformation stories, right? And so this, when what Goethe wanted to do when he wrote this story was he wanted something it would be a story of someone being educated, that the story itself would educate the reader, right? And I think this is at the heart of a lot of this genre of writing, that we see the unfolding of an individual in an authentic way, such that it causes us to gain a better understanding of who we are, right? So I have done this whole exercise of seeing this other person as another self. Let's flip that now. How do other people see me, right? And then from that question, we can see ourselves through the perspective of another self that I see from the perspective of myself. So it's like a
living mirror.
Yeah. Right. So there's something that's really formative about that, because this exercise of encountering the other, the alterity, the otherness of the other person, has caused me to now consider myself as an other to another, right? we're all selves in that matter. We're all individuals. We're all I's. But for someone else, I'm not an I. I'm a you or a him, right?
Mhm.
And so this can cause us to consider, okay, how might other people see this aspect of me that maybe is problematic or maybe is growing, right? And it allows us to have some more perspective on our life. You could even change this into a more eternal perspective. How does God see me?
Mhm.
Something that is completely other, right? Divinity, God, something that I have a very difficult time in grasping, right?
But still experienced in a personal way.
Right. And so now I can make that move. How does God see me? And then this can really light a fire under me, right? It can change me. And I think that's really what happens in these moments of grace is that we might not know it consciously, but what's happening kind of under the hood in our soul is we read the story of another that causes us to think of ourselves as someone else's other. And that causes us to see God as that other, such that, well, how does God see me? Do I like what he sees in me?
Mhm.
And can I transform
Right.
in grace with his help, right?
Mhm.
And so I think that's kind of I don't know, my understanding of what happens in these great moments in the history of the saints, right? Of reading these lives, and I think the particular power of the written testimony
Yeah.
as a way to do this.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very, very helpful framework. Could we maybe dive into then, like, more practically, what does that look like? Maybe
Yeah.
some examples from you know Edith Stein's own autobiography or others.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that maybe a good it's an autobiography that not many people have read. So maybe if you're watching this or listening to this and you've never read Life in a Jewish Family, here's an exercise for you. You know, pick up a copy of this book from icspublications.org, and take a look at and begin reading and put these practices into your reading practice. We're not trying to approach the other person. We're not trying to approach Edith or her mother or the family members that she relates from the perspective of like, how is this like my family, or and maybe that's fine in a moment, but that's not the meat of or the essence of what we need to be doing when we're reading. But rather really approach her and her writing and her story as something completely alien, something completely unfamiliar. And it's impossible because we all know things about her. We know how the story ends, for instance. But we can kind of bracket out that and be intentional with the sort of narrative that she presents to us. She doesn't start at the end. We know what the end is. She didn't know what the end was when she wrote this. She writes this 9 years before she dies, so she doesn't know the ending. And so let's read that at its value in that place of her own authenticity and intentionality. And I think that's where we need to go with when we read spiritual autobiography. Set aside our preconceptions, our
It's like
images.
that conversation I had with the other person, to like be kind of this open slate to receive whatever it is the other's giving.
Well, so just to maybe give a kind of a last word, a last thought on this whole, I don't know, way of reading spiritual autobiography, and maybe in Life in a Jewish Family in particular, it's to say that it's to go back to the story of Teresa Benedicta's own conversion in reading the life of Teresa and what she experienced in that moment, that culminating moment. And so then kind of the neat thing about her then going to write her own autobiography. And it may not seem spiritual from the outset, but if we take all of this in mind, we have all this in mind of what we've been discussing, then we begin to see how deeply interior and spiritual it is. And remember, too, she's writing this story after her conversion, and everything she's writing is going to, and she doesn't end up finishing it, unfortunately. But she's writing with the conclusion of her story in her mind, I imagine, being her own conversion. right? She's relating this story, and all the things she's relating is in the context of her having converted to the faith. It's looking back through her life, knowing, being a Catholic, about to enter the convent, and she even wrote some of it in the convent. Not a good part of it, some of it in the convent. And so she's engaging in this writing project with her own conversion as the culminating moment in the narrative that she doesn't get to, unfortunately. And so we can see a change in her. Someone who previously, when she was writing her dissertation, found the religious experience of others difficult to say. I don't know what to say about mystical experiences or religious experience of other people. That's how she ends her dissertation. Now we see someone who does have an understanding. She has experienced it for herself. And so I think when we go about this project of reading, this act of reading, we might not understand everything that we read, but it's going to affect us. It's going to change us. And I think that's where the real importance lies. It's not in memorizing every factoid about the life of this person. It's not about being able to relate personally to everything they experience. It's not even really being able to find a point of commonality such that, I would find this person to be a good friend, or maybe the way that they write drives you crazy. I mean, we hear that about Therese, right? That people don't like her style because it's very particular in a time and place and style. All of that can be put aside, and what we can really encounter is not the style. We can encounter the person, and I think that's where this aspect of transformation happens within the context of these great moments of grace that when we read these books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of just how important it is, the things that we take in our lives, because they have real impact and they change us. So if we're taking in trash, it's going to affect a change in us. And if we're taking in beauty and truth and goodness, that's going to affect a change in our souls as well. And it seems like this genre of spiritual autobiography is like doubly so. That's true, because it's like, not only am I experiencing something beautiful or good, but I'm experiencing like this other person who's I'm encountering this other person, and they're being a part of this transformation that's happening within me. Well, great. Thank you so much. I think this was, for me, a very interesting conversation. I don't know if could you say something? We mentioned Edith Stein's dissertation on empathy. Could you?
Yeah, so her dissertation is published in English. It's the title is On the Problem of Empathy. It's not the most accessible thing that we publish, but certainly with some slow reading and methodical note taking and something that can be understood, certainly. And she really lays out much more than even we spoke about in the context of this episode with respect to how we encounter the other.
Yes.
So there's more to discover even within that we didn't cover in this.
Right. And while that's a very a more difficult read and very philosophical, life in a Jewish family is very different.
Very different. Yeah. It's very accessible.
A little bit of a big book, but
yeah, it's thick.
It reads quickly.
I don't know what was your experience of reading it?
Yeah, I think I love reading autobiographies and letters of the saints, because I really do feel like I encounter them in a very real way. So that was my experience of it. There's certain parts where I was laughing.
My favorite part is when she has to bathe the wounded general, Polish, or he's a Hungarian general or something, doesn't speak German. And he's just like a complete just character, and her just sort of consternation at having to do this very not fulfilling job.
Yes.
This is when she's a nurse in World War I.
And I really like the part where she's talking about the the angst that she's going through in writing her dissertation, because I've been to that place, that dark place, so many times in writing papers of myself, where it feels like the whole world is just collapsing around you. But the way she expresses it is just, it's so relatable.
The other favorite story I have from is, and I don't want to give everything away, but all the stories, but with the story of when she helps her friends cheat on the test, and I think she's like a senior in high school at this point. She tells the story of helping her friends cheat on the test, and she's almost like proud of how ingenious their technique was, and so just a really fun. You really get her personality, and you see a lot of that kind of the photograph saint. And oftentimes she's depicted, or the photo that they choose is the one where she doesn't like to smile in photos. I like this photo because she's kind of smiling.
Yeah. A little bit.
But you don't get that experience of her and the story she tells, and you can tell that she was quite a gregarious and fun person to be around.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so we highly recommend that book, Life in a Jewish Family. But apart from that, really just any of the autobiographies of the saints. I mean, we would really promote the Carmelite saints, I think, Saint Therese and Saint Teresa of Avila.
But now that we have an Augustinian Pope, we have to present the Confessions.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
in honor of Pope Leo XIV.
Exactly. Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this episode, and be sure to come back next week for our next episode. God bless you.